All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 23, The Great Depression. So, this is a chapter that focuses on the decade of the 1930s, primarily. The Great Depression lasts, again, roughly speaking, from 1929 until 1941. And when we think about the Great Depression or the decade of the 1930s, we want to also keep in mind the decade that preceded it, and that was last chapter. And that was sometimes as they call it, the quote unquote roaring 20s. And this was a period of economic prosperity. It was a period of economic growth, of the rising material standard of living, a time period where people believed that poverty had been eradicated. The 1930s is a decade that is dramatically different. So the 1920s and the 1930s are often contrasted in American history as being the 20s, a period of prosperity, the 1930s as a period of depression. So the Great Depression lasts from 1929 to 1941. This is the longest and we'll say most painful economic crisis in American history. So we'll begin here with the origins of the Depression. That is, what are the causes of the Great Depression? Why did it happen? Well, the sign or the signal that there were some bad, economic times to come was when the stock market crashed on October 29th, 1929, known as Black Tuesday. This is the day the stock market crashed. And what this did, and this is an important distinction to make, this, we'll just say, symbolized the start of the Depression. It's important to note that even though the crashing of the stock market in 1929 was the beginning of the Great Depression, or what we consider to be the beginning of the Great Depression, it is not considered the cause, right? And that is a distinction to make. So it's not as if the stock market crashed and then the Great Depression happened. It's that there were already a whole host of problems with the American economy, and the fact that the stock market crash was just a symptom or a symbol that the economy was in a very difficult position. If it helps you, think about when you get a cold. When you get a cold or when you become sick, you may sneeze or you may cough, but it's not like the sneezing and the coughing is causing you to get sick. It's that you're already sick. And so the economy, in a lot of ways, was already sick. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, that was just like a sneeze or a cough. That was a sign, okay, something is not right here. And if you're not familiar, I mean, just in a very kind of basic sense, the stock market, this is pretty much the total value of businesses, right? So each particular business, or at least each particular publicly traded business, has an evaluation, right? How much is a company worth? And how much a company is worth is based off of a lot of things. It's based off of how much do they produce? How many people do they hire? What do they expect their profits to be in the future? Each and every business has essentially this evaluation. You add all of those businesses together and you get the stock market. So that's typically when the stock market goes up, we would say that, oh, well, the value of businesses are doing better. When the stock market goes down, the value of businesses are doing worse. So when the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday in October of 1929, when many of these businesses lost, in just 1 week, lost about one quarter of their entire valuation, and that would keep on going down for the next decade. That was a big deal. So just to give you an example of some of these things, We talked earlier about Mr. Rockefeller, John Rockefeller. His total value was cut to one fifth, or we might say, put it another way, we'll say that his wealth reduced by four fifths. So John Rockefeller lost about 80% of all of his wealth during the Great Depression. The company of U.S. Steel, right? This was the company that originally was founded by Andrew Carnegie back when we talked about the Gilded Age. Rockefeller and Carnegie, these were some of the two biggest and most valuable companies in the world. I mean, not even just in the world, in the history of businesses, in the history of companies. The price of a U.S. Steel stock went from approximately $262. Oops, what a two. 262. That went down to $22. So a huge loss there. And General Motors, one of the emerging industries in terms of the automobile and how important the automobile was in the 1920s, their stock went from $73 to $8. And again, this is just a broad evaluation of what you think these businesses or companies are worth. So, if the stock market was not the causes of the Great Depression, but a symptom or a sign that there were bad economic time period to come, what were the causes? Well, this is when things get a little bit more contested because, as students of history, one of the reasons why we study history is to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes we made in the past. And if there was ever a mistake in the past, it would be the longest and most painful economic downturn. So the Great Depression is a point for a lot of debate, right? Especially around the causes. But there are some definitive ingredients, we could say, that led to the downturn in the economy. We have one, two, three, four ingredients here that we'll discuss that were the causes of the Great Depression. The first one is rising inequality, and that is, in the 1920s, all Americans became, or at least maybe not all Americans, let's do this. In the 1920s, the average American was more wealthy, right? That is true. However, though, of all of the wealth that was gained during the 1920s, 10% was to all. That is, the average American saw their wealth increase by 10% during the decade of the 1920s. Meanwhile, the wealthy saw their average wealth increase by 75%. And so, why is that important? Well, one point that we will make about rising inequality is also tied to the second point here, and that is the decline in demand. And we'll also say that the declining demand is also a reason why the economy was in such a bad situation here. Declining demand can also be stated as overproduction, right? So demand means buying things, less people buying things. It's the same thing as businesses were producing too much. And part of this has to do with the inequality because I'll say the primary consumer class is the middle class. And when you have a lot of wealth concentrated in the hands of very, very few people, these are not the people that are going to go out and buy things, right? You need middle class people, kind of people who stand right in the middle of the income distribution in order to go out and purchase things. They are the consumer class is typically what we call them. And think about a lot of the commodities that were being produced and were really driving the economy during the 1920s. Number one was the car, right? Automobiles. Number two was the radio. And we might put other things like, appliances or something like that. Spelled correctly, but whatever. Um, and yes, it's true that during the 1920s, a lot of Americans bought cars, a lot of Americans bought radios, a lot of Americans bought appliances. But we could say kind of two things about this. One is that, if you would take this wealth and distribute it to, let's say, like 10,000 families, that's going to allow for 10,000 more car productions, 10,000 or sorry, 10,000 car uh, purchases. That's what I'm looking for. Purchases, 10,000 radio purchases, and 10,000 appliance purchases. When wealth is accumulated up to a small group of people, they're not the consuming classes, right? The extra wealthy person is not going to go out and buy 10,000 cars just for themselves. But if you distribute that to a bunch of families, they will drive the economy. So in some ways, these two things were interlinked. But another important thing about this declining demand that we might take note of, as far as what was driving the economy, cars, radios, appliances, these things you might, or we might say consumers, purchase rather infrequently. That is, once you buy a car, you're probably not going to buy a car again for maybe another 10 years. And if all of the growth in the economy was by the expansion of the auto industry, well, you could imagine someone at General Motors up here a little bit earlier, seeing how many car purchases in 1921 and 1922 and 1923, and it's going up and up and up and up. You might assume that by 1929, GM is going to sell, they're going to be worth $73 a share. The reality is that once Americans purchase their car, purchase their radio, purchase their kitchen appliances, they wouldn't need to buy those things again for another 10 years. And that's when the evaluations of a lot of these businesses were brought back to reality. And so, one of the reasons, or something we should also take note of as far as the stock market crashing, was that in reality a lot of those businesses weren't really worth as much as people thought they would. So declining demand over production is also going to be a problem, and it sounds kind of bizarre, right? Because how could producing too much of something be a bad thing? Well, a lot of our economy is based off of consumption. I mean, think about General Motors, right? They've built all these cars. It turns out that nobody's buying them. So now General Motors has to slash prices. They slash prices, they can't make as much money. They can't make as much money. They close down factories, they lay off workers. And this, this sends the economy into a spiral. Another point that we could point to is the rural collapse. And this is outside of the, sort of traditional, manufacturing industries. But several things are not farm prices, but crop prices declined. So this is not good for farmers. It's the same type of problem with overproduction, right? If you grow too much food. Another thing that had happened was there was more competition coming from overseas, and so American farmers were put into a more difficult position. But another big one was soil exhaustion. We'll talk about this in a section here coming up, but something called the Dust Bowl, which was somewhat of an irregular natural disaster. Just in the midst of all these other problems going on with the American economy, you happen to have a natural disaster that is like one of the worst natural disasters to hit farmers. It's just kind of a way for the um, uh, sort of a trick in some ways, right? Sort of like a sick joke, you could say. And the last thing is the overextended investors slash speculative bubbles, and this is some of the ways in which the stock market was over evaluated, or there was, people were very optimistic during the 1920s. They believed that the valuation of the stock market would just keep going up and up and up and up and up, and it would never end. So one example of how investors were overextended: stocks were bought, what they would say, quote unquote, on the margin. And to buy a stock on the margin, that's kind of like buying a stock on credit, meaning that, because the stock market kept going up and up and up and up, people were buying stocks with money they didn't have, buy now, pay later. That's good if the stock goes up, but if the stock goes down, then suddenly you're in a very bad position because you're far overextended. And the same thing about speculation. Now, speculation is normal, but there was an over speculation, an over optimism about the future of the economy. We'll just say about the speculative bubbles is that people believed, and this was wrongly, that the economy would grow. And there are other causes that we could potentially add to this, but again, I think these four are kind of a good start, right? Rising inequality wiped out the consumer class. There wasn't a strong middle class to buy things. Industries produced too much. Their projections on sales for cars, radios, and appliances led to them to overproduce. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, crop prices are declining, soil exhaustion is going on. The rural part of the country is in trouble. And then on the stock market, investors had allocated resources or allocated money in very poor ways. Now, the question was for the sitting president at the time, Herbert Hoover, what is his response or what is his answer be? And unfortunately for Hoover, who was the last of three conservative Republican presidents, for the most part, Hoover gets blamed for the Great Depression. And how much responsibility does Hoover have over this? Well, you can kind of debate that. There are certainly things that Hoover does that don't help the situation. But his name is always associated with the Great Depression and generally viewed as a very negative presidency, right? So Hoover ends up being blamed for the Depression. One was that he had the bad habit of always saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. So, for example, in 1930, when the Great Depression was just getting started, Hoover said the Depression is over. That was not true. And you might attribute this to some degree of maybe optimism, we might say. But for Americans, he had a complete misreading of the situation. He didn't understand it. He didn't know what he was doing. The United States responded to the decline in the stock market and the further descent into economic ruin by um, something called economic protectionism, and that is passing tariffs to try to affect American businesses. Now, it turned out that of the problems leading to the economic depression, that foreign competition was not a problem. In fact, the tariff, or the Smoot-Hawley tariff in particular, would only make this issue even worse. Again, the problem for Americans was that they were producing too much, not that foreign competition was coming in and putting American businesses out, which essentially are what tariffs are designed to do. Remember, a tariff, if you don't recall, this is a tax on imports. And the purpose of tariffs is to protect U.S. businesses. Tariffs were passed during the Gilded Age, primarily just to make businesses richer, right, more wealthy. But it was, the wrong prescription, right? If we think about the Great Depression as an illness, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was just the wrong medicine, right? It didn't treat the issue. We're just saying about the Smoot-Hawley tariff that this is the highest tariff in American history. And so as the stock market crashed and as things began to descend, the institution that, really at the center of this, the financial institution, was completely in ruined. One of the things that set in, and this also is very important in understanding why the Depression lasted so long, and that was panic. Because when there is no confidence in the financial system or no confidence in the economy, it makes it very difficult in order to remedy any economic situation. Bank run. So first of all, banks failed in much the same way that companies had to either downsize or companies went out of business. Banks went out of business. When you deposit your money in a bank, they don't just keep it there, they lend it out to other people. That's how banks actually make money. You deposit it in, they lend it to other people. So when the stock market crashed and when all these businesses couldn't pay back their loans, what had happened to people's deposits was that they were gone. And this led to bank runs. A bank run is when, we'll say, masses of people, quote unquote, run to the bank to get their deposits before it fails. Right? So, you hear that the banks are going out of business. You, as someone who deposited money in a bank, you go and run to the bank and say, look, I'm going to try and get my money out before that bank fails. Because if that bank fails, that's it. You just lost all of your deposit. And so this image here is actually showing us, well, this is the New York Stock Exchange, but these types of images, you can see photos from 1929 and 1930 of just swarms of people running out to the bank to try and take their deposits out. And you can imagine how troubling a situation was. And this was the case for many Americans, to go to your bank, a place where you had been saving for your entire life, and then just be told by the bank, sorry, we're out of business, we don't have your money. And that was the experience that many Americans would have to grapple with for the next 10 years. Section 3, Herbert Hoover and the Politics of Depression. So the question for Hoover was, now what? And so Hoover responded to the Great Depression through a number of different ways. Primarily was to encourage volunteerism, that is, to ask Americans to help each other during the depression, ask Americans. So, for example, Hoover encouraged, businesses said, hire people, right? Do what is good for the economy. He encouraged charities, church organizations, right? Help your fellow American out. And in fact, during the Depression years, there's quite a bit of charitable activity. Here we have a picture of a soup kitchen in Chicago in 1931 that would hand out free meals for the people who couldn't afford them. The problem with volunteerism, or just one of the problems with volunteerism, was that the problems that were going on in the economy, not just in the United States, but really around the world, were just too big for a simple, just kind of lending an extra hand to solve. Hoover went beyond that and, in fact, created an organization dedicated to promoting volunteerism within the United States economy. Now, unfortunately for Hoover, that acronym ended up being POOR, another way in which Hoover always managed to say kind of the wrong things at the wrong time. But this was the president's organization for unemployment relief. Right? You would think that if you're trying to resolve unemployment relief, you might want a better acronym than POOR, but this was founded by Hoover to promote charity. And so he was actually active in kind of promoting that idea. However, though, Hoover was hesitant to act beyond that. And one of the reasons why Hoover didn't do as much, because yes, he actually does do something. There's a misconception about Hoover being the do nothing president. And to a certain degree, he comes from that tradition, right? The Republican presidents of the 1920s, they were laissez-faire, hands off. And so the idea is that as Americans were suffering in the Great Depression, Hoover was just, sitting in his chair in his White House smoking cigars, doing nothing. That's actually not the case. He did do certain things. He did create poor. He did encourage volunteerism. He eventually creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So he did do something. The problem was that the things that Hoover did, it just wasn't enough, right? It wasn't enough to solve the economic crises. And one of the things that really hindered Hoover's ability to do more was his belief in associationalism. And associationalism, we'll call this the belief of Hoover, that only, we'll say, voluntary cooperation should be used. And another way to put that, and this will make more sense when we get to later on in this chapter for some of the things that Hoover's successor did. Um, Hoover believed in no individual government aid, that it is not the role of the government to provide any sort of economic relief to individual people. And, this was, in part kind of inspired by a belief of American individualism, that you don't want to diminish the incentives, to produce or to work. And so this is the line that Hoover never crosses, right? He's never willing to provide individual aid from the government to the American citizens. The line that Hoover does go to, and it's quite a big line to cross, especially for the time period, is in establishing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So the RFC, once again, is a policy by Hoover. But as we'll see, the RFC provided, we'll say, emergency loans to banks. What do we have? Railroads and businesses. All right, so notice that when it comes to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, Hoover is willing to provide aid for banks, railroads, and businesses. But does the RFC provide any direct relief to the people? Well, the answer is no, right? It doesn't provide any direct relief to the people. So not only did the Reconstruction Finance Corporation fail, so it did not solve the economy. The economy didn't get any better when banks were getting and railroads were getting more resources, but also it was what we might say an optic, disaster. Because just think of optics, how it's seen, how it's viewed. Never mind if it works or it doesn't work. Hoover has an option. He has government relief. He can either give that to the, but he can give that to the people who are suffering, who don't have jobs, who are, waiting in this line right here, hoping to get just a bowl of soup. Or he can give that money to the Rockefellers of the world, the JP Morgans of the world. Now, yes, Rockefeller lost 4/5 of his wealth, but the 1/5 of wealth that Rockefeller had was still more than anyone else. So the fact that Hoover was willing to give money to the Rockefellers and to the JP Morgans of the world and leave these people, essentially to wait in line, again, that didn't look good for Hoover's presidency, right? And Americans really turned on him. We'll use this quote here just to further this point. Hoover said in November of 1929, so this is right after the crashing of the stock market, probably not even a couple of weeks. He says, quote, "Any lack of confidence in the economic future and the basic strength of business in the United States is simply foolish." Well, looking in hindsight, the only one that looks foolish is, this quote from Hoover. Section 4, the lived experience of the Great Depression. So, as far as the Great Depression goes, there are different ways that we can measure this economic suffering. You can do it in a very statistical way, looking at things like unemployment, GDP, billions of dollars of exported goods, et cetera, et cetera. There's a statistical measure to the economy. But there is also a measure that is much more, we might say, human, and that is looking at families or looking at family structures, marriages, the number of children being born, looking through diaries, migration, stories, literature. And so this section captures a little bit more of when the Great Depression started to affect the broad American populace. So let's keep in mind that in 1929, this was the stock market crash. And for most Americans, when the stock market crashed, it was no big deal because only about 2% of the American population had even invested anything in the stock market. And so October 29th, 1929 came and went. And for most Americans, this didn't mean anything, right? They just woke up the next day, went to their work, went to their school, and just continued to live as normal. But remember, the stock market is a valuation of all of the businesses in the country. And so when the stock market crashed, well, that would lead to businesses either failing or downsizing. General Motors, for example, anticipating that they're going to build, this many cars in the next year. Well, that estimation is out the window. And now, because General Motors and all these companies are worth much, much less than they were before, that means they have less money to build factories, they have less money to produce cars, they have less money to run their business. So businesses, if they don't fail, they end up downsizing. And that means people are fired. And that's when the homelessness, lack of food, et cetera, et cetera. So even though we say that 1929 was the year that the stock market crashed, really the years of the Depression, at least the years of the depths of the Depression, it's not until 1932 and 1933, right? It takes a little while for the Depression to get to Americans, but by 1932, 1933, it's there. And so this section opens up. We have a few quotes of individuals who lived during the Depression here. We'll just read through them to get sort of a sense in the way that Americans were feeling this time period. This quote says, quote, "When the breadwinner is out of a job," and the breadwinner, if we're not familiar, this is like the single income family, right? So typically in those days would have been the male breadwinner, and that was a job and a paycheck that supported everyone. So this one says, quote, "When the breadwinner is out of a job, he usually exhausts his savings. He borrows from his friends and relatives. He gets credit from the corner grocery. All of these resources are finally exhausted, and it becomes necessary for these people to go on assistance." Another quote says, "A wage work plan which had supported 11,000 families collapsed last month. Detroit can see no possibility of preventing widespread hunger and starvation." So here we see the clear impact of downsizing. This one it looks like a work plan which was canceled, and how that leads to hunger and starvation. So Americans had to deal with this economic downturn in many ways. We'd mentioned earlier bread lines and soup lines. Charities that sought to feed Americans. And to show you the resentment that Americans had towards Herbert Hoover, Hoovervilles, this was the nickname for, we'll call them shanty towns, built and lived in by homeless. So what had happened was a lot of Americans lost their job. They lost their job so they couldn't pay rent. And as a response to that, they simply just had to make their own housing out of whatever they could find. And this was so prevalent that entire towns of, hundreds, if not thousands of people who had been, priced out of their homes just made these makeshift cities. And again, Americans called him a Hooverville, saying, "Look, this is what Hoover is responsible for." There are also other things like the Hoover blanket, which was a newspaper. And so we can definitely see kind of how Americans viewed Hoover from some of these nicknames. It should be worth mentioning. I don't want to talk too much about statistics, but probably the statistic that matters the most is unemployment. And unemployment is a little bit tricky because unemployment refers to not just the people who don't work, it's the people who are trying to find work but can't, right? So these are people who want to work, they're looking for work, but they just can't find it. And unemployment during the Depression, again, like all years, it goes up and down, but it's about 25% throughout the entire Depression. So one quarter of the population that were trying to find jobs simply couldn't find jobs. Now, when it came to depression, everybody felt the consequences or impacts of it, right? Nobody was safe, including John Rockefeller. But again, for the extra wealthy, they lost a lot of their wealth, but they could still get by. And the same thing was true for, the middle class, right? The middle class, it hurt, but again, they were better positioned to weather the storm. But even within the different classes, from upper class to middle class to lower class, there was disproportional suffering based off gender and race. So, for example, married women were, in many cases, the first to lose their jobs. So, across racial lines, across class lines. And this was reinforced by the stereotype of the breadwinner husband. Especially a married woman who had a job during the Depression, she faced a lot of pressure and ridicule from people saying that she was stealing the job from a man who could potentially support their family. So, in many cases, married women were some of the first ones to lose their jobs. And the same thing is true for Black Americans. Say compared white Americans. So for all of the measures of unemployment, we'll just use unemployment. That's kind of the standard one. Black unemployment was higher than white unemployment. So while it's true the Great Depression affected everyone, it did disproportionately affect some Americans more so than others. Now, when we think about the American economy, especially into the 1920s, we associate it with urbanization, the Industrial Revolution. We're looking at oil and steel. And yes, this was a main driver of the American economy. But like we learned earlier, the rural parts of the country were not safe. And so, especially for farmers who were affected by the Great Depression, they were forced to move. And in fact, the Great Depression caused a significant amount of internal migrations. Um, we mentioned earlier that some of the ways that we can measure the Great Depression is how it affected families. Families relocating from one area to the next in search of jobs, in search of employment. That is kind of a way that we can measure this. So when we mentioned in the last section, or whatever section it was, that the rural part of the country was hit by a once in a century natural disaster. Well, we call this the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl, these are the severe droughts, say in the we'll say Midwest, much the area from 1932 to 36. So it's like we already have all these other problems going on with the economy over here, and then we just happen to get some of the driest weather, in a century that comes at the very same time. And the Dust Bowl. Your textbook doesn't have any images here, but you could probably go and look them up on your own. But the top layer of soil was very, very dry, almost dust or sand like, and then huge windstorms would blow the dust into the sky, more or less blacking it out. And so A combination of already problematic economy and extra dry seasons meant that if you were a farmer in the Midwest region, you had to go find a new place to live. And there were massive migrations from the Midwest to the West Coast, specifically from Oklahoma to California. In fact, so many people moved that that group of people even got a nickname, and we called them Okies. Or an Okie was, let's say, a person or people who moved to California pretty much during the Depression or the Dust Bowl. Your textbook cites that 440,000 people moved. And photos like this one here show the uncertainty about the economic future of the country. We also have another photo down here of a family on the move migrating from Oklahoma. This family doing it by foot, walking over 100 miles in search of a greater economic future. The Depression era and the Depression suffering was also written down in various forms of literature. So we can look at books and poems that were written from the 1930s that talk about themes of economic suffering. And perhaps the most well known was a book called The Grapes of Wrath. Was, we'll say, a book that illustrated the the themes of suffering during the Depression. And one last point that we'll make about migration was not only was there a lot of in migration, Americans moving from one place to another, Oklahoma to California, but as far as migrations go more broadly, the Great Depression was a time period where more Americans, well, yeah, we'll leave that. No, that's misleading. More people, because people who come to the United States might not be American yet. More people left the United States than entered. And that's very rare in the history of the United States. The United States is typically a country that gets far more immigrants than it gets emigrants, people who are leaving. And the Great Depression is one of those rare times where more people were leaving because of how bad the economy was. Moving on to section 6, the bonus army. And the bonus army best illustrates really the way in which the Hoover administration completely botched everything in regards to the into the Great Depression. So one thing that we might point out is that an economic depression is not just bad for the reasons we talked about in regards to losing your house and losing your job and not having enough food and poor health and all those other things. It could also lead to social instability. And social instability might just be like a fancy word for rioting or riots. And one of the major social upheavals during the Depression era was the bonus army. And the bonus army and the way in which Herbert Hoover dealt with the bonus army in large part just sealed the deal for his presidency. So the bonus army, in short, this was a group of World War I veterans that marched on Washington, D.C., where the president was and where Congress was, to demand their bonus pay be given out. So these were a group of World War I veterans, hence the term Army, and they had gone to Washington, D.C. to demand their bonus pay. It's the term bonus. These veterans had been, guaranteed, promised, whatever you want to use, additional pay, but this additional pay was not going to come out for a later time. So they weren't going to get paid until like the 1940s. Because of the economic downturn, they wanted their money now. So a giant group of veterans, maybe or so, 5,000 or so of them went to Washington, D.C. and wanted to put pressure on Congress to say, hey, look, pass a law that will give us our money now. By the time they actually got to Washington, D.C., those 5,000 veterans turned into like 10,000 just disaffected people, right? These were people who had lost their jobs. They may not have been necessarily veterans themselves, but they went to Washington, D.C. And this was, at least in the eyes of President Hoover, this was the making of perhaps a very troubling situation. Well, to make a long story short, not only did Congress shoot down the idea of giving them their bonus pay, so Congress voted no, they would not get their pay early, but Hoover called in the Army. And the U.S. Army destroyed the settlement that the bonus army had set up in Washington, D.C. Machine guns, I think tanks might have even, or tanks in there, I don't know. Machine guns were brought out. The U.S. Army was brought out. Hoover called the bonus army insurrectionists and more or less crushed the, whatever you want to call it, right? The gathering of World War I veterans. And so just, imagine that image in the eyes of the American public. Here you have a sitting president who is ordering the army to attack World War I veterans. And if there wasn't already enough reason to hate Hoover at this time, certainly his response to the bonus army just made him even more disliked by the American public. Section 7, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the First New Deal. So Hoover's days as the United States president were numbered, and in the election of 1932, it was Herbert Hoover attempting to hold on to the presidency as the Republican running against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the Democrat. And at that point, Americans had had pretty much enough of Hoover, and it didn't look good for him during this election. Now, Roosevelt, who was Roosevelt? Well, Roosevelt comes from the same type of background that really one of his mentors, or not mentors, one of his idols came from, who was in fact not that closely related to him, and that was the earlier president, Teddy Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, he was technically a very distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, but there's no direct relationship between Teddy and Franklin. But they were very similar in their backgrounds and very similar in how they approached the presidency. He was from the upper slash elite classes, came from a very wealthy background, but was in the career business of public service. Instead of going into private industry and making billions of dollars or inheriting all the money from the family, Roosevelt decided to go into public service. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was Governor of New York. But in the 1920s, Roosevelt was affected by polio, and polio is a condition that causes paralysis. During the 1920s, Franklin Roosevelt lost control or lost the use of his legs, and he spent a lot of the 1920s recovering his health. And so Roosevelt's health is going to constantly be kind of one of the things that he struggles with his entire life. But his ability to overcome his bout with polio also lended itself to Americans viewing Roosevelt positively. and you might be able to say Americans could sympathize with Roosevelt for having gone through that. Um, Roosevelt ran in the election of 1932, promising Americans a new deal. So this is FDR's, and we'll use FDR for short. FDR refers to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR's plan to solve the Great Depression. And in the 1932 election, Roosevelt said, elect me and I will provide Americans with a new deal and get us out of this economic mess. And with that, with all the failures of Hoover, Roosevelt was elected to the presidency in 1932, and Herbert Hoover was given a defeat. And so immediately Roosevelt began working to turn this New Deal into a reality. He hired an inner circle of experts. He called this the quote unquote brain trust. Just call this Roosevelt's inner circle of experts to take action in the economy. And his inauguration speech is, of presidential inauguration speeches, Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 is one of the more well-known ones. It says, quote, "This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself." So Roosevelt too was being very optimistic about the future, but at the same time, what Roosevelt did was much more than Hoover did before him. And that's kind of that fine line that Hoover would not cross. Recall that Hoover said no aid to individuals. This is what Roosevelt is willing to do away with, right? He is willing to provide aid to individuals where Hoover wasn't. And Roosevelt is, one of the reasons why Hoover seems like a do nothing president is because Roosevelt does so much more. In fact, Roosevelt's actions in the economy are unprecedented, right? No other American president will do more to involve the government into the economy than Franklin Roosevelt. So, Roosevelt's now elected. He promised Americans a new deal. He has a brain trust, a bunch of smart people around him advising him and telling him what to do. Says to Americans, look, don't worry about it. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Okay, what do we actually do here? Well, unfortunately for us, a lot of stuff. So that means a lot of notes and remembering a lot of different pieces of legislation. But we'll try and make it as simple as possible here. Roosevelt got to work immediately, and in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency, Roosevelt passed more laws than any other president in his first 100 days in office. So Congress was very active. And again, let us just recall here we are going to say, Roosevelt did this, Roosevelt did that. But when it comes to our separation of powers in our federal government, really the lawmaking body is Congress. So yes, Roosevelt passed all these laws, but Roosevelt had a Congress that was willing to work with him, and that is sometimes a little bit overlooked, right? The president can't actually pass any laws. The president does have some influence in terms of like their leadership, for example. The president can put pressure on Congress, like Teddy Roosevelt did earlier. But when we say Roosevelt passed these laws, just keep in mind that it's FDR and the Congress. That Congress agreed with Roosevelt's new approach. And again, Congress is about as close to a proxy to the people as you get. So priority number one was banking. Banking was, In terms of all the industries that had failed in the United States, the finance industry was perhaps the most crucial. Roosevelt issued a bank holiday. This was to close down all the nation's banks. And while the banks were closed down, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, and this would, what we might say, provide federal inspections to banks and only allow the good ones to open. And this was a way of trying to instill some confidence back in the banking system. Earlier we'd said that a lot of banks failed. Bank runs occurred where people try to get their deposits out. Well, as a result of that, people were no longer willing to invest money in the banks because they don't want to see their life savings disappear like it did during the stock market crash in the early years of the Great Depression. Well, the problem with that, and we had sort of alluded to it earlier, is that the banks, they don't just sit on they don't just sit on your money, but they provide out loans. Well, where do they get those loans from? Well, they get them from deposits. So if nobody deposits into the banks, then there aren't going to be any loans. And if there are no loans, then the question is, well, how can businesses grow? Let's say there even is a situation where maybe General Motors wants to hire a couple more people, or maybe they want to open up a new plant. They think that things might get better in the future. Well, typically they don't have that money right now. They need to take out loans. Well, if nobody is making any deposits, there's no loans are available. And so therefore businesses can't grow. And so you get stuck. The economy is like a tire stuck in the mud. It doesn't matter how much you spin, you can't get out. So a way to alleviate that is to say, look, we know that the banks have failed. We are going to, as the government, intervene in the banks. And if the banks are good, then hopefully that will allow people to deposit money. This will allow for loans to be made, and this will allow for businesses to grow. And that was the idea. And this was a way to instill a certain set of confidence back into the system. But even this wasn't enough to convince Americans to deposit. And in fact, one thing that separated Franklin Roosevelt from many of his predecessors was the way in which he used the radio. Because even after the bank holiday, closing all the banks down, issuing the Emergency Banking Act, inspecting the banks, and only opening the good ones, Roosevelt took to the radio waves and more or less begged Americans to deposit money in the banks. These radio addresses were called fireside chats. The fireside chat, these are radio addresses by FDR to the American public. And among the things that Roosevelt talked about in the fireside chats was to encourage Americans to deposit. And, the radio was somewhat of a new technology. People had used the radio to listen to sporting events and listen to, entertaining shows. But Franklin Roosevelt was one of the first presidents to really use the radio in an effective political way. And, with a couple of other financial reforms, the banking system did start to recover. So, additionally, part of the financial reforms was also to pass the Glass-Steagall Act. This banned the mixing of what we call commercial and financial banking. So, for example, this again, mixing of commercial and financial It's not financial. No, that's not. Is that the right word that I want to use here? No, it's investment. Sorry. Ban the mixing of commercial and investment banking. So what banks had done before Glass-Steagall was here, instead of making loans, another thing they did was they took people's deposits and they put it in the stock market. Because you might be able to make more money in the stock market than you can on a loan. Well, the stock market is more volatile, it's more up and down. And so this was a way to make banks safer. Look, you can't take money and stick it in the stock market, stick it to loans. Loans are a little bit more safer. On the consumer side, the reforms also included the FDIC, which is Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. And pretty much what it did was it provided government guarantee for deposits. So before, when the bank went out of business, those who had deposited money in it, they were out of luck. Now with the FDIC, what the FDIC does, it says, look, if the bank fails, the government will give you your money back. So this was a way to tell people, look, don't be afraid of putting your money in the bank. I know that a lot of people, or maybe there's a recognition that when banks failed in the past, people lost their life savings, but from here on out, feel free to deposit your money in the bank because if the bank fails, the government is going to come to the rescue. And so, a combination of all of these things, a bank holiday, the Emergency Banking Act, leading with Americans, um, a lot of these financial reforms led to a slow and steady recovery of the financial system. And it's also the beginning of, it's the beginning of a lot of regulation in the financial industry that is very much still with us today. The banking and the stock market and the financial sector, they are in some sense over regulated. They're regulated more than other industries. And, the New Deal was in some sense the beginning of a lot of that. So the first crisis that Roosevelt dealt with was the financial system because no matter what industry, farming, cars, oil, glass, whatever it is, all of it relies on finances. And if the financial industry is not good, none of those businesses can grow. Once the financial industry was properly addressed, then Roosevelt could get to other aspects of his New Deal. Now, one of the things I really dislike about learning about the New Deal is that in some cases it just ends up being a mess of alphabet soup that there's all these various different programs that are created and in some ways it just becomes a matter of memorization and unfortunately there's not really any way around it. So we're going to discuss one, two, three, four, five, six New Deal programs. Again, all of these things are designed to solve the Great Depression, and they all do a little bit different in terms of what their actions are. So let's just go over these things real quick. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a work program to build infrastructure that hired primarily young men. So, jobs, unemployment was a big problem during the Great Depression. Potentially civil unrest was also a big problem. And so the CCC in particular was a work program that hired young men to build infrastructure, mostly outdoor projects that were very demanding in terms of labor. Another program that was created was FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This was to provide, or we'll say provided, direct cash to state relief agencies. And, this is a big kind of point about the New Deal is that, a lot of the ways in which this assistance is put out is that you have the federal government, and that's what Roosevelt's in charge of, the federal government. He's president of the United States. But there are already a lot of other apparatuses in place, like individual state governments. And so a lot of the New Deal programs or assistance or relief, it goes from the federal level, but then it gets distributed to the states. And then it's within the states that they distribute it to the individual people. So a lot of these programs follow this path. Now, there are some that don't, and we'll talk about the important ones in the next section. But for example, something like FIRA, this would go from federal to state down to population and distribute, unemployment or sort of whatever they saw fit. Other New Deal programs included the Agricultural Adjustment Act or the AAA. This was targeted towards farmers program designed to raise crop prices by limiting supply. Was to help farmers. Essentially, it paid farmers to not produce. And the idea is that if farmers just stop growing for a moment, the price of crops will rise, and then that will allow farmers to sell their crops at a higher price and make a decent living. Another New Deal program was the NIRA, the National. Sorry, a little bit of confusion here. So, the National Recovery Administration is the NRA. This was created as part of the National Industry, National Industrial Recovery Act. Again, if all these letters weren't confusing already. So the National Industrial Recovery Act, anything that comes with act means that it's the law that is passed. This thing created the National Recovery Administration. So the National Recovery Administration is the body, the organization. The National Industrial Recovery Act is the actual law. And what it did was it sought to get businesses to cooperate for the sake of the American public. So there was an idea that one of the causes or one of the contributing factors to the Depression was that businesses were too competitive with each other, that cutthroat competition put pressure on businesses to lower wages as much as possible, to fire as many workers as possible. And the goal was profits. And what this law was designed to do, the NIRA and the body that it created, the NRA, it said, look, we American businesses, we're all Americans. Let's try to cooperate with each other, not not race to the bottom and firing the most amount of workers, and try to do something that was good for the American public. The idea that competition was bad and we ought to eliminate competition between businesses. So, this was designed to help help business and urban workers. So you can see kind of the broad array of assistant programs, helping states, helping farmers, helping urban workers, right? Everything else. Other things that we can point to, the Civil Works Administration, the Public Works Administration, we'll just say these are work programs. Work programs were a big part of Roosevelt's first New Deal, especially. We call it sometimes the first New Deal and the second New Deal because there's a bunch of legislation that is also passed towards the end of Roosevelt's first term in office. But the idea behind work programs, it solved many problems. One, it put people back to work, so it put money in their pockets. But all these work programs, CCC, CWA, PWA, whatever it was, the point about these things is that they were also investments. There's an idea that, you can create wealth by just paying people to do some sort of menial task. That's not what these work programs were, right? They weren't paying people to dig a hole and then fill it back up. They weren't paying people to push a rock up a mountain and then shove it back down. These were bridges, electrical grids. These were roads. I mean, this was vital infrastructure that if you spend the money now, presumably it'll actually pay back in the long run. Section 8, the New Deal and the South. So the New Deal also provided the federal government an opportunity to invest in parts of the country that had lagged behind the rest. You know, the South, in many ways, had lagged behind the rest of the country. We might also just mention that in addition to the South, there was also an emphasis on the West. You know, when we talked earlier about the Gilded Age, it was mostly the northern part of the country or the northeastern part of the country that saw a lot of economic prosperity. And so the New Deal allowed for investments into parts of the country that before weren't as profitable. So, for example, you might have something like the TVA have the ability to build infrastructure related to electricity, whereas a company would not be willing to do that in the South because they couldn't make its money back. So, in terms of wages and economic productivity, the South lagged behind the rest of the country, and therefore the programs in the New Deal could be used to like make the South catch up, or that was the idea, anyways, or invest in the South when when private businesses were not private businesses couldn't because it wasn't profitable. Before that, though, let's do mention one of these laws. And again, AAA, if you remember that from last section, that is the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And that was designed to help farmers. Now, one thing about the New Deal is that a lot of these things are new, right? In some ways, they're experiments because the government had never taken a role in the American economy in the way that it does under Franklin Roosevelt. So, for all of that alphabet soup that we talked about in the last section, I mean, nobody really knew how those things were going to play out. And the AAA is a perfect example of not just the experimental nature of some of these reforms, but also some of the unintended consequences. Because the AAA actually had some consequences that hurt people in the South as opposed to other sections of the country. So recall that the AAA was designed to limit the production of farmers. So farmers wouldn't be producing as much. Well, what this meant was that for tenant farmers, so a tenant farmer is somebody who farms on someone else's land, farmers, and sharecroppers, many of them lost their job because of the AAA. Again, it's giving farmers incentives to limit their production. So if you're the landowner, that's good, right? You might get some relief from the government. But if you're a tenant farmer or a sharecropper, if you're working on someone else's land and now you're getting resources to not grow, all that means for tenant farmers and for sharecroppers is that you're fired, essentially. And so, some of these New Deal programs, yeah, they hadn't been tried before, but they could also have some unintended consequences that um, didn't quite benefit all Americans. Um, as part of Roosevelt's New Deal and as part of his administration, he also passed the Fair Labor Standards Act. And what the Fair Labor Standards Act is most well known for was established a federal minimum wage. And because the South had some of the lowest wages in the country, this affected the South the most, right? That people in the South saw their wages rise more so than anyone else around the country. And lastly, we have the TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is a prime example of the way in which the New Deal could invest in parts of the country that were neglected by private businesses. And this was a work project, to say a work project to bring electricity to the South. So the investment of bringing electricity led to jobs being created in that particular region. It also led to a certain amount of environmental degradation, which is something also to consider with some of these work projects. But we won't go into too much detail about that. But bringing the benefit of having electrical power, whereas that would not have been brought by any private business. Section 9, Voices of Protest. And this section really tries to focus on the criticism or the criticism of the New Deal. People who thought that maybe what Roosevelt was doing was not the best course of action. Now, one important point to make is that while, yes, Roosevelt did make a lot of unprecedented changes when it came to the American economy by closing down banks and establishing all these work programs. Compared to what was going on in Europe, if we just take a moment and zoom out and look at what's going on in the United States as compared to what's going on in Europe, is that Roosevelt's changes, you might say Roosevelt's New Deal was, quote unquote, nothing compared to we'll call the socialist and fascist responses in Europe. The Great Depression was not just in the United States, but it was all around the world. And the prevailing economic system, capitalism, and the prevailing political system, democracy, for many people around the world, it had seemed as if these things had failed. And we definitely see the ways in which Roosevelt is challenging capitalism, challenging this notion of a free market. But other countries were willing to go much further to completely abandon capitalism, to completely abandon democracy, and reorient their economic and political systems in an effort to try and alleviate the Great Depression. Roosevelt, say what you want about the New Deal, but it's not a complete abandonment of democracy. It's not an abandonment of capitalism in the same way that socialism and fascism was. So, again, the idea is that yes, Roosevelt's changes were pretty radical, but it's really nothing compared to what's going on in the rest of the world. And interestingly enough, most of Roosevelt's criticism is not that he's doing too much, right? It's not the conservative criticism that he's doing too much. It's the criticism that he's not doing enough. And in fact, probably the greatest and most well-known critic of Franklin Roosevelt was Huey Long. Huey Long was, we'll just call him a Democrat. From Louisiana. They criticized Roosevelt for not doing enough. And he had a plan to counter the New Deal that was called the Share Our Wealth program. This was a program which the federal government would confiscate assets from the wealthy and redistribute. The Share Our Wealth program and Huey Long more broadly was sometimes called Robin Hood. And if you recall or are not familiar with the story of Robin Hood steals from the rich and gives to the poor. So this was a response that was much more significant than what Roosevelt had been doing. To simply just redistribute wealth was part of a Share Our Wealth program. And, from this slogan or this campaign button here, it says, "Every man a king, share our wealth society." And that's what Huey Long promoted. Now, Long would eventually be assassinated. This was related to some local politics in Louisiana, but he was shaping up to challenge Roosevelt in re-election in 1936. Roosevelt would be up for re-election, and yes, some of the things about the Great Depression had improved, but the Great Depression was not over. And Americans, liked the idea, like their European counterparts, of going towards a more radical solution. As Huey Long said, quote, "How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what is tended for 9/10 of the people to eat?" And so this was very much reflecting the fact that wealth accumulation had happened at the top end of the economic distribution. Um, but it wasn't the only critic that Roosevelt had. In fact, there are a few other noteworthy ones. Francis Townsend was a doctor from California. And we'll say he criticized Roosevelt for not helping, we'll say, the elderly, and we'll say physically, say, I guess we could say disabled. Essentially, if we look at Roosevelt's New Deal, a lot of the work programs were designed for people who can work. And yes, that did provide some relief to the working age population, but what about people who can't work because they're too old? What about the people who can't work because they have some sort of physical disability, or something that prevents them from working? And so Townsend was saying, look, Roosevelt, yes, all these work programs are great, but you're missing a very important segment of the population. You're not doing anything for the elderly, and you're not doing anything for those who are actually unable to physically work. And so again, Roosevelt would have to contend with this criticism, which in many cases was accurate. Another critic was Charles Coughlin. Charles Coughlin was a Catholic priest. We'll also describe him as a populist, that is, for the people. And he criticized Roosevelt for helping banks, really before or more than the people, which in some case there was some credibility to that. Remember, one of the big focuses of Roosevelt's New Deal was the financial industry, and that was one of the first things that the New Deal tackled. Well, according to Charles Coughlin, this was at the expense of the people. Now, it's also very important to understand one of the themes that Charles Coughlin is also playing on here is anti-Semitism. And that is to sort of posit to his radio audiences, which, by the way, both of these individuals, all right, Coughlin and Townsend, were on the radio. And, we'd said that Roosevelt was very effective at using the radio. That's true, but so were his critics, right? Those who criticized him could also use the radio to spread their message far and wide. But, Charles Coughlin really played on the broader anti-Semitism to link, right, to connect the dots between Roosevelt as helping the banks. The banks are part of an international financial system. And so Roosevelt is, at the expense of the American population. Roosevelt is sort of in cahoots with this, sort of Jewish banking conspiracy. And that was to use the anti-Semitism in order to broaden his popularity. So it wasn't just pointing out that the first thing that Roosevelt addressed when enacting the New Deal was in dealing with the banks. It was to play off broader anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic beliefs that were held by the broader population. So most of these criticisms here, Coughlin, Townsend, and Huey Long, right? All of these people are saying Roosevelt is not doing enough, and that would be one criticism of Roosevelt: do more, be more radical. But the criticism coming from the other side is conservative, meaning that these are people who believe that Roosevelt has done too much. And maybe the most logical critic of Roosevelt was big business, right? A lot of these businesses disliked, these are businesses who dislike the regulation and oversight of the New Deal. They would prefer going back to a laissez-faire, social Darwinistic, hands-off approach. Now the government is becoming much more involved in the business, harkening back to the progressive era. And maybe Roosevelt's nemesis in all of this was the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, remember, when we think about the breakdown of power, the Supreme Court is primarily responsible, we'll say, for determining constitutionality. So we have essentially, on the one hand, we have the New Deal, okay, which again includes all sorts of laws. Then we have the Constitution. And the question for the Supreme Court is, does the New Deal follow the Constitution? Can the president just close down every single bank in the country for 4 days? Well, when it came to some of the things that the New Deal passed, the Supreme Court said no. In fact, Roosevelt did not have the power to do that. And of the pieces of legislation that were struck down, the AAA was struck down by the Supreme Court. And so Roosevelt has to, kind of always keep in the back of his mind that no matter what law he passes or what legislation he wants to pass, will the Supreme Court strike it down? And for that reason, the Supreme Court is definitely Roosevelt's most formidable adversary, because they do have the power to invalidate what is passed by him and the Congress. Section 10, the Second New Deal, 1935 to 1936. So one of the things that Roosevelt faced was that when his critics attacked him for certain parts of his New Deal, he felt that he needed to address some of the legitimate ones. And that, in some ways, we might say the criticisms, especially the ones in which Roosevelt wasn't doing enough, we might say motivated Roosevelt to more action. And those actions were called the quote unquote Second New Deal, another round of legislation designed to address the economic problems of the nation. So, amongst the laws that were part of the Second New Deal included a Works Project Administration. We're just going to call this more work programs. Don't really need to get too much into the details. But of the two laws that were part of the Second New Deal, one of them that we ought to know is the Wagner Act. And the Wagner Act, this was a law that guaranteed the right of workers to unionize. And because of the Wagner Act, Roosevelt is considered probably the most pro-union president that the United States has ever had. Arguably, I mean, this is, might be the most pro-union legislation. And so when it came to, the two different sides of business and labor, via the Wagner Act, Roosevelt was making it very clear that he offered protections to labor unions. And because of the Wagner Act, unions saw some considerable gains during the Depression era, despite all of the economic downturn. So, for example, one series of incidents known as the sit-down strikes, which occurred in 1937, which you also see depicted here. These are strikers guarding the factory in Michigan. The sit down strikes were when the UAW, this is the United Auto Workers, won higher pay and better hours. And this was, I believe, at General Motors. The protections provided by the Wagner Act also led to or helped contribute to the creation of another preeminent union in the United States, and that was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, otherwise CIO, we'll just say, uh, to, in some ways, rival the largest union at the time. And recall that union was the AFL, right? So the American Federation of Labor is still out there, but the CIO emerged because of some of the protections that were offered as we call it a rival. I mean, they're both fighting for the same things for workers, but the CIO and the AFL would rival one another in terms of like America's largest, most influential union. The leader of the CIO was John Lewis. We'll just call him the leader of the CIO. So the Wagner Act is a big part of the Second New Deal, giving workers unprecedented protection that the federal government had never offered before. But probably the most significant law passed during all of Roosevelt's time in office, New Deal, First New Deal, Second New Deal, whatever it is the Social Security Act. And the Social Security Act is really the centerpiece, arguably, of Roosevelt's New Deal program and really symbolizes the significance of the New Deal in its totality. So the Social Security Act was primarily motivated by the criticism that Francis Townsend had levied against Roosevelt, and that was, yes, he had offered job programs, but what about the people who couldn't work, right? What about the elderly? What about those with physical limitations? So the Social Security Act did a couple of things. It provided fundamentally pensions for the elderly. That was to provide direct assistance. A pension is like a retirement plan, elderly, to provide direct assistance to people who were too old to work. It also included, in some cases, dependent children, right? So like orphans or something like that. And in many respects, the idea behind this was, or where it was more or less unprecedented, was that this was a direct connection between federal government and individual citizen. And so, the relief or the welfare would go from federal government to individual person. And for all the programs and laws that were passed, you had never had such a clear and direct relationship between the federal government and citizen. And of course, what is in the middle of that is the general welfare of the citizenry. And so, what we take from the Social Security Act, which is still in effect to this day, by the way, um, is more or less what it symbolized. And this was a recognition that the federal government would take, or say was responsible for the welfare of its citizens. Right before the New Deal, and specifically before the Social Security Act, the idea was that the governments are here to protect our rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And that's fundamentally what governments are designed to do. And governments aren't really designed to make sure that there are enough jobs out there, and to make sure that people have a home, or make sure that people have food to eat. We talked earlier about ethnic communities and mutual aid organizations and how people look after one another. Well, when we come out of the opposite end of the New Deal and we look back and say, okay, what did the New Deal really mean? What is the importance of the New Deal? Um, Arguably, it's this point here, right? The New Deal, in some sense, fundamentally changes the relationship between the government and its citizenry. And it changes the relationship in a way in which the federal government is, after the New Deal, now responsible for the economic well-being or the welfare of its citizens. And the Social Security Act, by providing support for the elderly, is the hallmark of that. So as far as the second New Deal goes, Social Security, and we can see how this was a response to some of the criticisms that Roosevelt had earlier. So again, I would say as far as second New Deal, Wagner Act 1, Social Security Act 2, those are probably the two most important parts to remember. That was enough, by the way, to cause Roosevelt's reelection. So we'll just maybe take note, reelection in 1936. And part of the reason why Roosevelt did a second New Deal, why he did a bunch of new laws, was in part to help his reelection. Wanted to show the American public that he was doing, enough, or doing more than what was demanded. And so he won re-election in 1936 and would continue with his policies forward. The next section, section 11 here, equal rights and the New Deal. So this section gets a little bit into the ways in which the New Deal could, in some sense, create inequities in the way that it was distributed. They say that the New Deal provided, quote unquote, something for everyone, but the New Deal did not equally benefit all groups of Americans. So, for example, when we had talked earlier about New Deal legislation being passed from federal down to the states, you could have, especially in states of the Jim Crow South, those resources and benefits not be applied to African American populations. And in fact, there was a rather popular trial that took place during the 1930s that highlighted many of the issues that were going on in the Jim Crow South. And this was the case of the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys were a somewhat highly publicized trial. This is where 9, we'll say, young African American men were given the death penalty for assaulting 2 white women. And the evidence was not very strong. And the fact that these 9 young men were sentenced to death based off of the evidence that was present created national outrage. And in fact, you had a lot of people from, not just from the South, but from other areas, come in to provide a defense for the Scottsboro Boys. This became, we might say, a national symbol of racial injustice. And when we think about the Roosevelt presidency and the New Deal more broadly, one of the issues that Franklin Roosevelt did not handle head on, or did not tackle head on, was the issue of race and was the issue of Crow. We have to recall that for Franklin Roosevelt, who was the Democrat, that Southerners made up a large constituency of his voting base, right? Southern Democrats, recall that the Democratic Party in the South had existed all the way from the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was the party of the North. The Republicans were party of the North. We might just say that Southern Democrats provided FDR a strong voting base. And so when asked, about passing like something like an anti-lynching law or tackling poll taxes that disenfranchised African Americans in the South, Roosevelt more or less responded by saying, "Look, I just can't take the risk," and that risk was losing some of his voting base in the South. So the Southern Democrat remains part of Roosevelt's coalition during 1932 and 1936. So the South continues to vote Democrat. FDR doesn't really do anything to disrupt that apple cart. However, though, because Roosevelt's New Deal programs brought, maybe this is worth writing down, something for everyone, right? Remember when we talked about the alphabet soup of all those programs, we had something in there for the farmers, we had something in there for the workers, we had something in there for the people of the South. It provided something for everyone. It brought a lot of people into the Democratic Party, right? These are Northerners that used to vote Republican that were turned away by Herbert Hoover and are now voting for the Democrats. In fact, Roosevelt's presidency is significant for some of the political shifting that goes along. So the New Deal coalition, this is, we'll call the groups of people who support / vote for Roosevelt. And of course, of the constituency, we have the Southern white population that continues to vote for Roosevelt, right? They don't move away from him during his presidency. But we also have in the North urban workers, right? Roosevelt's protection of unions. Again, most urban places, cities are in the North. And again, the North had historically voted Republican. They are now voting for the Democratic Party for the very first time. Farm workers, right? Farmers traditionally voted for Democrat. For a brief period of time, they voted populist, but they definitely didn't vote. Sorry, they could vote Democrat in the past, but some of them did move away to the populist party when that was gaining traction. So the rural parts of the country are also throwing their support behind Roosevelt, and national, or we might just say urban liberals are also. So we consider the New Deal coalition as bringing groups of people together that had typically been on different sides of the political aisle, now all voting for Roosevelt. With that being said, though, Roosevelt's New Deal programs, like we mentioned at the top of this section, could create inequities in terms of benefits, right? Not everyone shared in all the benefits. So, for example, in some of the New Deal programs, there was exemptions or certain professions that were exempted. Domestic workers and farm laborers, we might say, were often left out in terms of New Deal benefits. And these were professions, say, where a higher percentage were African American. So none of, at least as far as I'm aware, none of Roosevelt's New Deal legislation explicitly stated, oh, well, the CCC is for whites only. But they could exclude certain positions, right? So domestic workers might not be included. Well, disproportionately, there are more African Americans that are domestic workers than there are white Americans. Same thing with farm laborers. Remember with the AAA, sharecroppers were unintentionally affected by this. And in the cases where New Deal programs were handed out to the states, if we're talking about southern states with Jim Crow, you could have federal dollars going down to the states, and then at the state level, that's when you could have it unequally applied between white and black populations. So, the benefits were not enjoyed by all Americans equally. And the same thing was true of men and women. So, for example, women, we might say, could and did have, let's say, more obstacles to New Deal benefits because we'll say many assumed husbands slash men, or the breadwinners. And we talked about this term breadwinner a little bit ago. Breadwinner is just, who provides income. So in some ways, the New Deal reinforced earlier stereotypes. And this is true of the Great Depression more broadly. And that is not just from the New Deal, but Great Depression plus New Deal. And this is in stark contrast to the earlier decade. Remember, the 1920s, there was a lot of questioning and challenging gender stereotypes. The Great Depression and New Deal, both of these things reinforced gender stereotypes. All right, the last couple of sections here, section 12 and section 13. So, the end of the New Deal, 1937 to 1939. So, Roosevelt's passing of the Second New Deal on the eve of his reelection in 1936 once again reignited his struggle with the Supreme Court. And Roosevelt had feared that because of the Social Security Act, that the Supreme Court might strike down his New Deal legislation. And so he proposed a plan to essentially bypass the Supreme Court to ensure that his legislation was, had stayed enacted. So he proposed a court packing plan. So we might say that FDR feared the Supreme Court would invalidate the Social Security Act. So he proposed, that is Roosevelt, adding more judges. These judges would be chosen by Roosevelt to get the votes he needed. So imagine, right? So when we think about the US Supreme Court, they serve for life. So once you get once you get appointed to the Supreme Court, you're not going anywhere. And, it could have been the case that as far as the makeup of the Supreme Court goes, I believe, there's 9 on the Supreme Court. I think there were still 9 back then. But, there might be, let's say, 5 no votes. And Roosevelt knew this because the Supreme Court had already struck down some of his laws in the past, right? They had struck down the AAA. So of the members of the Supreme Court, there might be 5 no votes and 4 yes votes. So Roosevelt feared that, well, maybe when Social Security came in, that would also make the Supreme Court vote no on it. So the court packing plan said, well, look, can't get rid of any of these guys. They're there for life, right? The president doesn't have the power to do that. But what if we add 2 more judges? Now, those judges would be chosen by Roosevelt. The 2 more judges would give Roosevelt 6 votes for the yes position, 5 no votes. And that would be a way to make sure that Social Security was not struck down by the Supreme Court. This plan, court packing plan, was criticized for, we'll say, a quote unquote grab for power. When we think about the powers that are, when we think about the US Constitution and the separation of powers, and we have an executive, legislative, and judicial branch, a key component to that is checks and balances. The idea that one branch can't accumulate so much power that the other branches can't stop them, right? The idea is that the Supreme Court should be able to check the president or should be able to check the legislation. Well, if the president can just change the Supreme Court in a way that suits whatever laws or policies that he wants to pass, that's a breakdown of the system of checks and balances. And in fact, when we say that Roosevelt is one of the most powerful presidents in U.S. history, those that criticized Roosevelt would probably use his court packing plan as maybe his most ambitious plan for giving himself more power. However, though, when it came to the court packing plan, two things. One was that Congress rejected it. That is, Congress, stood up to Roosevelt and said, "Look, no, we're not going to go along with this. We agree with all the New Deal plan that is going to help the American public, but once you start messing with checks and balances and the three branches, that's at least from the position of Congress, that's going a little bit too far." And it turns out that at the end of the day, the thing that Roosevelt was worried about, the Supreme Court ended up approving Social Security. And so in some ways, Roosevelt's fears that they would strike it down was unfounded. And the problem, resolved itself in some ways. So the court packing plan was defeated. Congress rejected it, and that plan never went into effect. But Social Security remained constitutional. Wagner Act remained constitutional. His fights with the Supreme Court were had the fights with the Supreme Court had really kind of seceded because or receded, excuse me, because what was going on at the time, or what was gaining most of people's attention at the time, was that World War II was underway, right? European and Asian wars were breaking out. Now, after Roosevelt's second New Deal, he actually kind of let off the gas when it came to spending. And in 1937, we'll say a decrease in spending caused a dip in the economy. Things had gotten better, but the Great Depression was not over. And so the Roosevelt recession of 1937 meant that, the United States, or Roosevelt himself, still had to lay on the gas, right? There was still a necessity to remain very much active in the economy. And this is when Roosevelt and the United States more broadly fully embraced the economic idea of deficit spending. Deficit spending is to spend more money, say, than one makes, to stimulate the economy. And this is an economic approach that, for the most part, with a few exceptions, the United States has embraced ever since the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. This is sometimes referred to as, I'll spell this name wrong, Keynesian economics. Right, it's demand side economics. And so, deficit spending would be a hallmark of really American fiscal policy ever since there. So when we look back at the New Deal, and of course, what's looming on the horizon here is World War II, which we will get on in the next chapter. And in some ways, the American economy took a little bit of a backseat to the bigger global issue of the world's most destructive war. But when we look back at the New Deal and we think, okay, why is this so significant, right? What is the legacy? What is important? A very important thing to understand about the New Deal is that it did not end the Great Depression. That's what it was designed to do. That's what the goal was. But before the Depression ended, World War II broke out, and the United States was thrown into a global conflict that was really unlike anything else the world had ever experienced. With that being said, even though it did not end the Great Depression, there are still some very, very important things about what the New Deal did. One of these things we talked about earlier, and that is fundamentally changing the relationship between the federal government and its citizens, right? Citizens, we'll say, saw the federal government as an ally in daily struggles, right? And by daily, primarily meaning economic. An ally in daily struggles, right? The The federal government was now responsible for the well being of its citizenry. Another legacy of the New Deal, which maybe is not as important, but certainly worth mentioning, is that it did shift politics. Many, uh, we'll say, new voters for the Democratic Party. Ever since ever since the Civil War, for the most part, the political parties had still been pretty sectional. I mean, there might be a couple of exceptions here and there, but the Republicans were for the North. This was from like 1850 until 1935. I mean, for the most part, Northerners always voted Republican, Southerners always voted Democrat, and Franklin Roosevelt changed that, right? A lot of people in the North began to cast their ballot for the Democrats. And so it kind of shifted the political landscape a little bit. And maybe most importantly, or not most importantly, actually, but for everyday people, it was the memory of the Great Depression. The Great Depression was one of those events that for people who lived during that time, or even if you know relatives that lived during that time, the memory of the Depression shaped people's behaviors and attitudes for generations afterwards. We'll say the hardships of the Depression forever changed the people who lived through it. As this quote says, I'm talking about the Depression here, still riding with the ghost of those days when things came hard. This is a survivor of the Great Depression, giving an account in the 1960s. So, things like not trusting the banks, saving everything one gets, the fear that at any moment, at any time, the economy can go into a death spiral. This was with the hearts and minds of Americans for generations to come.